Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about a artistic movement in photography called pictorialism. I think it's important to note that artistic movements are often grow into other movements and can be a response opposite and equal to previous artistic movements. They don't happen in a vacuum. In the 19th century, photography was largely looked upon as a technical process with no artistry to it. You just point the camera, take a picture, do some chemistry, and voila, you have a sharp picture. But a lot of people treat it as not photography, as not art. I even hear that today, unfortunately, but we're going to talk about it in a new light. In the late 19th century, there was an artistic movement called pictorialism. A number of people said photography is art, and they advanced that concept. And part of the mechanics of what makes anything art, in their view, and I agree, is a reflection of the artist's hand, the artist's vision. Not when I was in photography school, my wife was in the illustration department, and there were people who were described as a good wrist. They could draw exactly what they see, but they had no ideas. And that's what they said in illustration. Well, the pictorialists said, we need to see evidence of the photographer in this photograph, not a picture of this person, but that their hand reflected this picture. This happened when the picture was being taken. This happened in the darkroom as well. This happened in the choice of photographic process. The pictorialists believed that photography is art, and they wanted to advance that idea. The first of these movements was the Brotherhood of the Link's Ring out of England. And this was started by, or one of his founding members was Henry Peach Robinson. You're going to remember his name from Fading Away, that photograph that was done from 5 separate negatives of a girl as she dies during the night. In France, the major member was Robert Duchamp. And he came from a very wealthy family. His father had set up a very successful banking system, the Banque Duchamp in France. And so he was rich his whole life and never had to work, never held down a job. So he could do whatever he wanted. It's not known exactly what or whom introduced him to photography, but he did start around 1870 and pursued photography, and he embraced lots of other processes like gum bichromate, colorization of photographs, and a lot of manipulation of his photography for effect. In the United States, the group was known as Photo Secession, and it was started by Alfred Stieglitz, also a person who grew up in wealth and never had to work. That will come up later. He started a gallery on Broadway at 291 Broadway called Little Galleries, and he embraced photographic materials that could, in his opinion, stood up to the test of individual art, recognizing the artistic vision of the photographic creator. He launched a magazine called Camera Work. We'll come to the name Edward Steicken later. Edward Steicken was asked to design the cover and design a typeface for it. We'll see an example of it in our PowerPoint shortly. And it became Stieglitz self-published and assembled and put the photographs in every one, and it became a vehicle for people to become known. He also formed the group Photo Secession and invited Gertrude Kasebier, we'll get to her name, Clarence Hudson, Steicken, Boughton, and Brigman into the group as participants and fellows. Now, on your list is the name Clarence White, Clarence H. White. Clarence H. White grew up in Ohio, and at the 1893 exhibition in Chicago, he saw photography and was spellbound by it. And it's from here that he launched himself as a photographer. Later, he met Stieglitz, and Stieglitz embraced the style of his photography. But here's where a personality conflict arose. Stieglitz was independently wealthy, and White was not. And Stieglitz did not have a family to take care of, and White did. So when White sold photographs, Stieglitz basically berated him for having stooped so low as to accepting money and being in commerce over photography. So Clarence White needed a way of making money. He launched the Clarence H. White School of Photography in New York City as a way of employing photography to have an income for his family. Such notables as Margaret Burke White and Dorothea Lange, names we will see in a couple of weeks. Dorothea Lange, you saw her name during documentary. Margaret Burke White, we will come to her when we get to women in photography. Both came out of that school of photography. I want to emphasize that Stieglitz had a really overbearing personality, which ultimately cost him a lot of his colleagues. The next name on your list is Fred Hollanday. In his day, he was known as F. Hollanday. He was out of Boston, and he was invited to join Photo Secession and apparently turned it down. His photography was quite interesting. Very often, his stuff was considered homoerotic or lots of male nudes. And we are talking over 100 years ago. It's a different world than it is now. He also did a lot of Christian themes, presenting, photographing, doing self-portraits of himself as Jesus. One critic described him as his work as the work of a sick mind, but a lot of the critics loved his work. Gertrude Kasebier studied photography overseas, and I met Alice Boughton there. And Gertrude Kasebier was a portraitist, and Stieglitz invited her into the Photo Secession group. Gertrude Kaisber's theme was, her predominant theme was the role of women and the importance of women as mothers and in motherhood. And it's seen in a lot of her photography. She was also what was known then as a free woman or freer woman, which would have been the expression of the day for women's liberation. An advocate of women's vote. Believe it or not, women couldn't vote then. They couldn't own land. They couldn't participate as a jury member. It was a very different world. Sometimes I would like to recommend that you read Trifles or A Jury of Her Peers. Look these up and read them, and it'll tell you it's a window into women's rights or lack of 100 years ago. Edward John Steicken actually was born in Luxembourg, and the family moved to America, where he went to a German English school, but spoke the language of Luxembourg at home. And he became interested in photography. Steicken would ultimately become the most highly paid photographer in the world. And with him, we can credit the birth of fashion photography and celebrity photography. For a number of years in the early 1920s, he was the photographer for Vogue and Vanity Fair, owned by Condé Nast. So his stuff is you will recognize his stuff for sure. Alice Boughton was a portrait photographer in New York City and considered one of the greatest. One more comment on Steicken. Stieglitz once described him as the greatest photographer who ever lived. Boughton was a portrait photographer in New York City, in the New York area. And she went on to pursue, her style shifted into pictorialism. She did lots of female nude photography. And she studied overseas and with Gertrude Kasebier in France. Coincidentally, they're at the same school. Anne Worthrop Brigman was out of the Bay Area and stepped into photography. She was actually born in Hawaii. Her grandparents were missionaries in Hawaii. And she moved back to the United States. She met a sea captain and sailed with him. And then around 1910, they separated and she settled in the Bay Area. She stepped into photography and ultimately taught photography. And she came across a copy of Stieglitz' camera work, read it and admired it, and wrote him a letter speaking of her admiration of his work and his editorials on photography, his commentary on photography. And through that, she made contact, and he saw her work and invited her to hold membership and ultimately fellowship in Photo Secession, New York. And her stuff was shown multiple times at little galleries at 291, which is the street address on Broadway for his gallery. Also, her work was shown a number of times in camera work. Camera work is a collector's item today. If you find it on eBay, it's like $700 to get a copy. I would love to get a copy. Now, ultimately, she was invited to join the Linked Ring of London. Her fame actually really took off worldwide for her photography. Most of her work were female nudes in the High Sierras. We'll see examples of her stuff. She was also something of a poet, and she wrote a book, Songs of the Pagan. And this is her poems combined with her photographs. Now, the pictorialist movement began to wither after World War II and more or less dragged its feet until around 1940 when modernism fully took over. A few more comments here is modernism was a rejection of anything from the past. With the mid 1900s, say around 1908, 1909, Stieglitz saw the work of a painter and put it and introduced it through his gallery and through his book, Camera Work. The painter was Pablo Picasso, and the work was his abstracts. Now, he showed his work when Picasso came to New York. He showed his work in his gallery. Nothing sold. That ought to make you cringe. You could have bought a Picasso for $10. I'll tell you a quick Picasso story. They say that in the last 10 years of his life, he never paid for anything. He paid for everything with a check, and his signature was worth more than the face value of the check. So none of these checks were ever cashed. He didn't pay for anything. He just wrote a check, which was never cashed. But at one point, Picasso was nobody, and the critics mauled his work. So the Cubist movement dawned before 1910 and was advanced through Photo Secession and through the little galleries and camera work. Then there was a group called the Futurists. The Futurists argued that the future is going to be beautiful and wonderful. Machines are going to make your life great. Think of Disney's Carousel of Progress, that kind of thinking. You know, washing machines, dishwashers, cars, automated world where everything's taken care of for you and your life is really easy. At the same time, there was a movement called the Precisionists, also known as the Immaculates. The Precisionists, the Precisionists were the first truly American art movement that didn't come out of Europe or somewhere else. A quick comment on the Futurists. Anton and Arturo Bragaglia photographed things in motion. They would catch things happening. And they weren't afraid. They embraced the long exposure and the blur of the camera. Paul Strand, a photographer who first met Stieglitz and showed his work there and was encouraged by Stieglitz, was something of a precisionist, photographing hard lines and architecture and machinery. Then after the Futurists and the Precisionists came this thing called World War I. And there were vast numbers of horror deaths, gas, automated machine guns, bombs, people whose faces were destroyed and ruined. And it became clear this was the end of Futurism as an artistic movement. It was realized that machines are not your friends. Machines can kill en masse. And it was really, it marked the end of Futurism as an artistic movement. The next thing is Dadaism. And Dadaism was a rejection of all of the past. Dada actually it's a mystery. Dada is actually French for hobby horse. Or as it's also been said, they opened up a dictionary, threw a dart at it, and it's landed on the word Dada. It's not, there's a big debate where Dada got its name, but it's pretty nonsensical. So it's depicted by things like a fur-lined mug or a wheel sticking out of a chair. The most noteworthy Dadaist was Marcel Duchamp. Marcel Duchamp, an artist of his day. We have photographs of him, but not his photographs. At one point, he was so upset with the art community, there was going to be an exhibition of art, and he submitted a man's journal and wrote on it, "Fountain." And the critics were appalled and disgusted. They didn't know that the noteworthy Marcel Duchamp had submitted this here. He submitted it anonymously, and they said, "This isn't art." They were outraged, and he said, "How can you say it's not art, really?" He did a painting called "Nude Descending a Staircase," which was, I have a photograph of a nude descending a staircase, plus his painting, which was described by the critics as an explosion in a shingle factory, as making no sense. And today is considered one of the greatest pieces of its day. Now, next came the Surrealists. Surrealism is the embracing of both dream and reality, that interface of dream and reality. Man Ray, whose name is actually Emmanuel Radinsky, his family changed their name to Ray, and his friends called him Manny. Ultimately, he went by Man Ray, was a photographer from New York who went to Paris and embraced things like what he called the rayogram, which is a photogram where you take items and put them right on top of print paper and expose them. And you have a cast shadow. Laszlo Mahali-Nagy was a member of an artistic movement in Germany called the Bauhaus. And the Bauhaus was really advanced thinking in design. Joseph Albers and colorist Eichen both worked there. Unfortunately, something came along called the Nazis, and the Nazis said, "You're a corrupt form of art," and they all had to get out of town. They all moved to Chicago and set up the Chicago Art Institute, which grew out of the Bauhaus movement. But they were really advanced modern furniture and such. Max Ernst was a photographer, designer of the Dadaist movement. He was decidedly anti-Nazi in a very big way, and we'll see his art shortly. Hannah Hoch was also a Dadaist, and she would do collage and montage work where you take multiple, cut out things and sort of glue them together onto a piece of paper, including photographs. So that's why it counts as part of the study of photography. Alexander Rodchenko. Alexander Rodchenko was a Russian constructivist, and we'll see examples of his work. John Hartfeld, I had made a mistake here. Max Ernst was something of a surrealist. John Hartfeld was the anti-Nazi guy. And his work are collages and montages with fragments of Hitler, speaking to the sheer violence of the Nazis. Now, I want to talk a little bit more with some examples here of softening your picture. I said earlier that the pictorialists would kick their camera. They had cameras very much like this. This is a 4x5 camera, and it has a mount on the bottom for a tripod. So you could set this up, take a picture and shake it a little bit. And this is a wooden film holder. They would go into the back of the camera for your film. In terms of manipulating your picture under the enlarger, there's a thing called burning and dodging. This is a dodging tool. You could actually hold this over your print. If part of your print was too light, you could put it here and reduce the amount of light during the exposure. Or use burn an area by cooking it with more light and just give more light to an area under the enlarger. Something else done was, hold on here, diffusion. This is diffusion. This is actually a woman's nylon stocking, which you can do this under the enlarger or in front of the camera. It will for color, it will warm the picture, but it will also soften the picture. You have to focus on the other side. You don't want to see this, but you look through it and you can focus on the other side of it. Another trick that was done was to take Vaseline and smear it on a piece of glass. To soften your image. And before we get too deep into the show, when we get to Steicken's work, some of those are lace held over someone's face. So you can see how this, at certain distances, it comes in tighter and tighter and tighter. It becomes sharper and sharper. You bring it too close to the lens and it's just soft. I want to try something like that. I'm sitting right here. What does this do to my picture? That really diffuses it. I don't think this camera's going to live up to it. I want to play my little PowerPoint here on pictorialism and the road to modernism. Sharing screen. Okay, this is loading. Opening. Patience, my friends. Here we go. Okay. Pictorialism, landscapes. Now look at this picture for a second. Some of these processes, this is actually looks like it was done with some pencil work as well. It softens the image. Part of it is the ability to capture a sense of air. Hold on, I don't know what happened. I'm told by my computer that my cloud is almost full. Now let's look at this. This is a form of carbon printing, Ozo type. And you can see what looks like grain, but almost looks like a haze in the air. And this is a pigment gum print. And again, it looks rather soft. It suggests the artistry in the hand of the photographer. So this is called Recessional 1895, a landscape. And here you can see the fog in the air. This is a silver gelatin print, which is like your basic black and white print as we have them today. This is George Davidson's Onion Field, 1890. Focus is soft. You can see a haze in the back to the mountains. And you get a feel of these as art or capturing a single moment, not just a record of a street or of a person, nudes. Now, in pictorialism, it is not unusual to work the print and to scrape it up and to draw all over it. Now, let's compare these two for a second. Clarence White's on the right and Alphonse Marie Mucha on the left. The one on the right would be an example of pictorialism. It's soft, it's a little more discreet. The one on the left is much more direct. I would lean in the direction of saying a little more pornographic. Look how worked this is. How much work they've done to the print surface. Study in Sicily. It's just not the nudity of women, but children, boys. Now, at this point, we're looking at a little bit of narrative work. This is a Manner of an Addicts. This is a platinum print. Platinum prints are really nice prints, but during World War I, platinum was declared a militarily significant metal, and it became unavailable to the average photographer. Childhood Dreams. This is gum bichromate, which can be colorized, which can be done in, you can actually pick the color you want to use and put it in. Robert Dimagi, he was the French pictorialist, and there's a ballerina and gum bichromate. Look how soft, look at the fuzziness. It's not out of focus, but there's an imprecision to the rendition of this. A still life, bizarre. Adolf de Meyer was something of an early fashion photographer and still life photographer. His career more or less his artistic style went out of fashion with the early 1920s, and his career just withered. Portraits. So this is Alfred Kerr, 1904 oil pigment print. It's interesting, they've eliminated most of it except for his face and his hand and his cigarette. In this case, I would say her face is out of focus. Another gum bichromate print. And this is a direct carbon print, which is another process. Should you take photo 12, you may be able to sample some of these other processes. This is called The Rose, 1903, gum bichromate. Cityscapes. This is Steicken's The Flatiron, 1902, gum bichromate over platinum. That's an interesting thought. Now, early 1900s, there was the beginning of color. There was the very beginning of color photography in the autochrome, and Steicken's one of the first people to play with the autochrome. But this is a gum bichromate over platinum, and you can colorize, partially colorize gum bichromate. So this is a Canal, probably Venice, 1894. And this is a carbon print by Frank Meadows Sutcliffe. Karl Strauss, New York, 1912. A German Street, 1898, gum by Crome. Brotherhood of the Linked Ring, England. This is Henry Peach Robinson, president or an early member of the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring. You'll remember him for this photograph, The Fading Away. And this was, I guess, their letterhead and their logo. This is the early membership of the Brotherhood of the Linked Ring. I couldn't give you a name on any of them. This, my guess, is the Netherlands by the water and the windmill. And you'll recognize this photograph by Henry Peach Robinson. This is Little Red Riding Hood and the wolf dressed up as grandma. So these are narrative images, storytelling images. Robert Dimagi, Photo Club of Paris. That's Robert Dimagi, a self-portrait. Now remember, he was extraordinarily wealthy. He never had to work. He could do whatever he wanted. He had no limits. Behind the scenes, this is a ballet shot. And again, it's in focus, but it's not. There's a softness to this picture, and the precision of rendition is reduced. Another ballerina shot. Boats. But look, it's like you can feel the air. Reading in a meadow. In Brittany. Brittany is part of France across from England. This is entitled Severity, and she looks severe. This is entitled Speed, and you can, if you can see the original of this, you see how much this has been worked. It's not just the manipulation of the print itself. This is called Struggle. And this is the sculptor Rodin in one of his pieces. This is called A Study in Red. Another one of his red prints. The Seine River. Valley in France. He really did all his work in France. Photo Succession, The Little Galleries, 291 Broadway. Stieglitz. This is Alfred Stieglitz. This picture was done by one of the members of one of the pictorialists, members of Photo Succession, Gertrude Kasebier. My wife can speak German. She says Kasebier is cheese and beer. Interesting. But you can see how much this picture has been worked around his back and around his head. This is a copy, the cover of one of the copies of Camera Work, edited and published by Alfred Stieglitz, New York. This he took on his honeymoon in Europe. This is Waiting for the Return in Holland. These are wives of seamen waiting for them to come back from their day at sea. This is in New York City. And again, it's like you can capture the air and feel the cold. This is Stieglitz and Georgie O'Keeffe. It is something of his muse. He left his wife for her. That's her hands. And again, New York City, horses in the winter. And he was one of the first people to live in a high rise in New York City, and he photographed out his window at other buildings. when people didn't live in apartments on the 18th floor yet. He moved into a high rise. He also photographed clouds a lot and saved those negatives. This is on his honeymoon. He was, and it's called steerage. So we have kind of a solid line separating first class from lower class people below. Now in the lower class in the dark, you see a man with his white cross suspenders. And Stieglitz saw that and said, this picture's perfect, ran, got his camera, set it up, and realized the guy was still there. The guy hadn't moved, and he got this picture, which is one of his defining photographs. Gertrude Kasebier, and that's her signature. This is Gertrude Kasebier, what they call a free woman. And this is one of her photographs. Remember, her theme is the importance of mother in raising children. This is entitled, Blessed Art Thou Among Women in the Raising of Children. She also knew a lot of indigenous Americans and photographed Indian chiefs. This is Chief Flying Hawk, Chief Irontail. Her family lived out west, so they were not unfamiliar to her. She was not unfamiliar to them as well. She took this picture in the home of Clarence White and his family in 1913. We were just before we went into World War I. This is called Dorothy, 1900. Evelyn Nesbit was something of a celebrity in those days and led I believe, something of the scandalous life, shall we say. Today she'd be all over, the magazines you see at the grocery store. This is called The Sketch. It was done in 1903. That's a self-portrait of Gertrude Kasebier. And this is fascinating how she's eliminated everything but her face and her hands. Now, this is called The Bride. So this would be a pictorialist way of photographing a bride. And this is another Rosie O'Neill as a bride. And I've done a comparison of styles of brides. For on the left, a more conventional bride portrait. On the right, how a pictorialist, the hand of the pictorialist in making a photograph. Alice Boughton, the Danish girl. Now, again, this picture is in focus, but it has a softness to it, a diffusion, shall we say. Dawn, circa 1909. A lot of them have a little glass ball. A lot of these photographs will have a little glass ball, which became very popular among pictorialists. These are her children. This was published in Camera Work in 1909. A still life. This is very much the world before World War I. You can tell by the clothes and the hair. This is probably in the New York area. That might be the Hudson River behind them. We don't know. That's where she lived. And that's Alice Boughton. And Orthrop Brigman. Has been honored by the Photographic Association Club of New York. And this is called Breeze. This is one of her more famous photographs. So women would go with her into the high Sierras and she'd photograph them. Incantation, 1905. storm tree, the bubble, again, that little ball, the cleft in the rock, look closely how they reworked it around the head. It's like a halo around the head of one of the figure on the left. I think that's certainly worth noting. Clarence H. White. This is Clarence White. This is a picture taken by Gertrude Kasebier. Blind Man's Bluff. The Kiss. Ring Toss. This is a triptych, 3-panel image. This is called Miss Thompson, 1907. This is just Nude, 1909. And this you saw earlier is Clarence White's work. White and Stieglitz teamed up on taking this picture and putting their heads together on it. Again, Miss Thompson. Fred Hollanday, you're going to find this fascinating. The self-portrait of F. Hollanday. Beautiful image. A lot of male nudes out in the woods. And this is Fred Hollanday, a self-portrait of him as Jesus on the cross. So his neighbors helped him stage this and set this up. And that's Fred Hollanday with a staged little halo. They even put the mark on his chest where it is alleged a Roman centurion drove his spear into Jesus on the cross. And these are the last words, and switch to the last words of Jesus. And that's Fred Hollanday again. Steicken. Now, an original of this, printed by Steicken, holds the record for the most expensive photograph in the history of the world. At auction, it claimed $2 million. You find a copy of this, I'll give you 20 bucks for it. He was an early, now my wife saw this, I've also seen this as a black and white. I don't know if it's hand colored or if he was an early experimenter with the autochrome, an early process of color photography that goes back to 1900. The Lumiere brothers developed it. Now that's why I held up that lace in front of my face for you to look at. This is Charlie Chaplin, actor, comedian. And this, of course, you recognize. That's Greta Garbo, actress. And he was photographing her and he was complaining about her hair. And so he just pulled it straight back and he snapped a shot. And this is like the famous shot of her. And that's Steichen himself. And now we have a few more pictorialist images. This is Steichen's Flatiron Building done by Crome, New York City. Stairway to an Attic. Duchamp, France. The Road to Modernism. But pictorialism laid out the groundwork for the road to modernism. And Stieglitz was at the front end of photo secession in New York. So was Duchamp laying out that groundwork, and Gertrude Kasebier, and Brigman as well. So this is the tail end of pictorialism. and before, or in the early 1900s. And at some point, Stieglitz thought, is this really all there is? You know, even he got a little tired of pictorialism. And you know, this is picture from his honeymoon. He's starting to think differently. And you know, by the way, his marriage was no good, and so he ultimately took it with Georgia O'Keeffe. And then was a new movement called the Cubists, and a guy named Pablo Picasso. This is one of Pablo Picasso's earliest pieces, one of his most important early pieces of abstract expressionism. Abstract is when you break up the parts. Cubism suggests that you have to see something from multiple sides to understand it. You just can't look at one side of something and get it. You need to see from different angles. And that's why the face is broken up in different ways. For example, look at the bull in the upper left. You can almost see two sides of the bull's face. And I think this one is about the Spanish Civil War and about the violence and the destruction of it. So here's some examples of photography as Cubist photography, breaking it up into its parts. This is David Hockney, a painter and also a photographer, and he used his camera to record movement, where he would photograph somebody repeatedly and tell them, you don't have to stop moving. This is his self-portrait, by the way. And this is his mother, to record a sense of multiple angles and motion. This is the work of Justin Dunell. I won't ask you that name again. And Andrew David Housey, he has a great system where he photographs the sides of a face all across the front. Same here. Stephen Eckel. So it would be good examples of Cubist photography, where you can see somebody from multiple angles and you learn more about them from different sides. Futurism. Futurism was a way of embracing things that are new. Futurism said, oh, you have nothing to learn from the past, forget the past, only the new matters. And this is the work of Arturo and Anton Bragaglia, motion and action. Well, the Precisionists, or also known as the Immaculates, were an American movement and advanced by Paul Strand. And it enjoyed clean angles, straight lines, kind of a comfortable old world view, very machine driven, mechanically driven. And this is one of his most famous pieces. And that's Paul Strand. Anton and Arturo Bragaglia. So they photograph things in motion. Here's a dog. You can see his feet in multiple positions, just buzzing along. World War I came in, and we had the arrival of tanks. This is an early Russian tank. It had each wheel had its own 250 horsepower engine on it, and it had a 50 caliber machine gun all over it. You see a power of machine guns, gas masks, people who were blinded by the gas or whose lungs were ruined, people whose faces were destroyed. A sculptor came in and was making masks to rebuild people's faces. So here's an example of a person whose face is destroyed, and they built a mask so he could go, so he would have a chance of going through life. You know, there were guys who came out of the war and said, I can never go home. My mother can never see my face like this. So this woman made masks. This sculptor made masks so that people could return home. And Dada was a response to war. One of the things Marcel Duchamp did was take a postcard of the Mona Lisa, draw a mustache and a goatee, and on the bottom you see LHOOQ. And apparently, and don't kill the messenger for the message, that means she's got a hot ass. I'm not making that up. Marcel Duchamp. So there's a photograph of a nude descending a staircase. And this is his painting, Nude Descending a Staircase, which was described as an explosion in a shingle factory. That's Marcel Duchamp. And this is an example of Dada art. I mean, absolutely useless, nonsensical. And this is his submission to that art exhibit. It's called The Fountain, and it's a urinal. And there he is posing with his piece. And here's another view of, I thought I eliminated this one, of his Dada art. Oh, and he was walking home and he saw an iron and he glued tacks to the bottom, which makes the iron absolutely useless. So here's another example of Dada art. Surrealism. Man Ray, Emanuel Radinsky, was an experimental photographer out of New York, actually originally out of the Midwest, moved to New York, then moved to France. This is one of his photograms. Again, all you do is set up a piece of print paper and put something in front of it and turn on the enlarger and let it expose and then develop it. It's really a cast shadow. And he's second from the right. This is one of his parties in the park. And that's Man Ray on the far right. That is Salvador Dali on the left with the crazy eyes. And this is Man Ray having shaved off half of his beard. Again, he's a surrealist, so that would make sense. Now, he was making a print at one point, and when we talk about women in photography, we're going to mention Lee Miller. And Lee Miller was his assistant. And the story goes, a rat ran across her foot in the darkroom. She panicked, threw her hands in the air, screamed, and turned the lights on accidentally. While he was in the middle of developing the print, she turned off the lights as fast as she could. And he goes, she apologized profusely, but he said, well, let's just see what happens. And the sologram was created. So this is a print in mid-exposure or mid-development, flashed with light. And you get this reversal, you get these black lines and such. Now, photograms, which is nothing more than an object on a piece of print paper, he tried to name it a rayogram and name it after himself. It never stuck. It's still known as a photogram. For those of you who have or will take photo 10, photograms are one of the very first thing you do. This is a slinky. And that's a picture he took of Marcel Duchamp as a woman. Duchamp, I guess, I presume, was gay or something, so he was fine with him to dress as a woman. Another photogram. Now look at this next photogram. This is the same one. This is the same as this. And here's the thing I want to point out. I found these in two different books, and these books weren't in agreement on which way is up for these photographs. So I didn't turn one. I found them in two different directions in two different textbooks on history of photography. Another one of his photograms. This is one of his most famous photographs. Another one of his rayograms or solarizations. And you can see the effect, following the contour of the nose and seeing how the shadow shifts dramatically with a deep, edgy line. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy was part of the Bauhaus movement. And he was a man of many talents. He was a sculptor, artist, painter, designed furniture, did lots and lots of things, taught. And this is one of his photographs. I pulled this off the internet, sorry about the quality of the image, but it's gorgeous. This is one of his photographs. This is one of his still lifes with pins of different colors. Interesting, we have empty chairs and full chairs. Another photogram. And it's interesting to look and watch all the things that's going on here. There's a pool player, top center, who's aiming it at a whole bunch, he's aiming his pool cue at a whole bunch of women. There's a woman on the left, mid-center, who's aiming her gun at a guy. A bunch of natives, I would think. And it looks like a scene from Africa in conference. There's something of the commentary on colonialism going on here and male-female relationships. So there's a line running from the silhouette of the man in the upper left all the way down to the woman's left breast. Another photogram. View from above. That's Mahali Nashi himself. Looks pretty austere to me. Max Ernst was another Dadaist. Not sure how that was done. I can't imagine he cut someone's arm off. That's ingenious. And this is montage art. If you look bottom on the hand, you'll see it looks like Man Ray. And then if you go up, the hand reaching down right below that looks like Salvador Dali and Max Ernst right next to it. One of his drawings. That's Max Ernst. Hannah Hock. So if you look closely, you're going to find Dada written in here in several places. So this is cut and pasted out and glued onto paper. We have, I see Dada once, twice, 3, 4 times at least. And Dada is, at that complete rejection of all things mechanical. I see many mechanical aspects to this, but it's all nonsensical. Another one of her montage pieces. And that's Hannah Hock. Alexander Rodchenko. So this would be Russian constructivist art. And here we see a figure with a gun and a 2 spoon tucked under his arm. I cannot read Russian. And that's a view from above at a phone. That's Rodchenko, a self-portrait. That's Rodchenko. Russian constructivist art. That's Rodchenko. John Hartfeld. John Hartfeld was a decidedly anti-Nazi guy. So here's a picture of a Hitler figure with bananas on his helmet. A bayonet going right through a dove of peace. A rendition of Hitler with coins for an esophagus dumping into his stomach and a swastika for a heart. Hatchets for a swastika. I don't know if that's dripping blood or hanging people from the tips of the blades. And the hands of the skeletal hand are actually the tails of combat aircraft. And on the ground, we have the dead of war. And there's a picture of Hitler, if I ever saw one. And that's John Hartfeld. Other modernist photographers. Charles Sheeler embraced very strong lines, something of a precisionist guy. Hans Bellmer would do still lives with parts of people. Paul Outerbridge also came out of the Clarence White School of Photography, and he was very much a very graphic, bold graphics kind of photographer. Raoul Hausmann was something of a Dadaist, making montages. Andre Kurtz, Surrealist. Okay, so there you go. And now it says there is not enough space to save this document to the iCloud. Purchase more space or remove some documents. I'm going to stop sharing. I hope that was of interest to you and that you found that enlightening. So you're looking at stuff that was created 100 years ago, like right now, into the 1930s, from the 1900 to from the 1890 forward to the 1930s to 1940, which was into the World War II zone. Pictorialism ended basically with the end of World War II. And now a lot of photographers, I see a lot of photographers who have embraced photo succession style photography, brown toned images, softer images, less precise images. They don't care if they've got flair in their picture. So it's making kind of a little bit of a comeback. I don't know if it's going to make a full comeback, but its styles go in and out of fashion. They really do. I appreciate your time. I hope you found this interesting. I'll be posting this weekend, and I hope to see you. As hardly anybody comes to office hours. Talk to me during office hours or send me an email. I would appreciate that. End meeting.